Happy holidays! It's the Thursday after Christmas, December 26th, 2013. This is the Hermetic Hour. I'm your host, Poke Runyon. And tonight we present a discussion on the lost and forgotten magical fantasy novel by the infamous science fiction hoaxer, Richard S. Shaver. Actually, Shaver's editor, Ray Palmer, was the hoaxer. Shaver believed he was writing the truth about the survivors of ancient extraterrestrials still living in caverns below us and plaguing surface people with their mind control ray machines. This dubious expose was called the Shaver Mystery. Back in the 1940s, it dominated the pages of Amazing Stories, America's most popular science fiction magazine in those days. Shaver's weird tales of the subterranean Dero World are enjoying a modest revival in reprinted editions. Now, we were among the first 21st century Shaver revivalists with our 2007 film, Beyond Lemuria. In our new version of the Shaver Mystery, we place the Cavern World of the Deros in another dimension, a parallel world, very close to our own. However, Shaver himself always insisted that his underground Deros were in this physical dimension, whereas his editor, Palmer, insisted that they were disembodied spirits. Now, extensive research into Shaver's writings, his fiction, fantasy, essays, and letters brings out another possibility. Shaver may have privately believed in the parallel world explanation. His essay, Fiction, Fact, Theory, Science, in Hidden World, number 5, reveals that he believed the fantasies of Abraham Merritt and James Branch Cabell to be true stories. We know that he was strongly influenced by both these writers and that he could actually channel their writing styles, a phenomenon that Palmer observed firsthand. Shaver was an empathetic receiver, a true mystic. He revealed what might be the real secret of his Cavern World in a marvelously crafted fantasy novel that never has had a title of its own. It appeared in 3 separate issues of Amazing Stories and Fantastic Adventures from 1947 through 1949. The first part was The Tale of the Red Dwarf. And next came The Daughter of the Night, followed in 1949 by the final chapter called Erdis Cliff. Now, the style is Merritt and Cabell combined, but the magical concept of the endlessly layered nows of the simultane derives from H.G. Wells' Men Like Gods, and Shaver goes much further with it than Wells went. In fact, I believe he coined the term simultane. In this, he preceded Michael Moorcock's fictional Multiverse and even M-theory and the M-theory of quantum physics by decades. So, if you want to discover a new dimension, as we said, tune in and we'll slide down the wormhole. Now, this is going to be a very interesting discussion tonight because we're going to start off with Shaver and give a very good rundown on his simultane concept. And then we're going to have 3 other magical adepts. They're going to be, well, I was going to say we have 3 magical adepts, because if I say other magical adepts, that implies that I'm a magical adept, and I don't want to imply that. I'll let you just assume that if you want to. So we have 3 magical adepts who are going to call in, and we'll discuss the other dimensions in magic. And not just based on the Shaver, but the whole concept of parallel worlds and other dimensions in the practice and the practical aspect of magic. So, but first, let's outline where Mr. Shaver is on this. And what I want to point out to begin with is that the key to this the key to this revelation of Shaver's parallel world idea is the Hidden World Journal, spring 1962, issue number A5. Now, these are all reprinted. Tim Beckley has reprinted the whole Hidden World series, which reprised the Shaver mystery and attempted to explain it in the 1960s. And, of course, the Shaver mystery itself ran in amazing and fantastic from 1945 through about 1950. And so then in the 1960s, Palmer started this small press. It's a small press journal, but it was well done, The Hidden World. And he reprinted almost all of the Shaver material. Plus, he gave Shaver a chance to write articles, and then he himself tried to explain this whole thing. Now, these Hidden World journals have all been, well, most of them, all the way up through 13, I think, have been reproduced by Tim Beckley at Global Communications, and they are available on Amazon. And, in fact, I had Hidden World number 3, Shaver's very controversial novel, Mandark, and I wrote the introduction to that one. So I'm kind of, in a sense, I'm kind of playing one of my own things here. But this particular Hidden World issue here, issue number A5, spring 1962, this is the one where Palmer and Shaver both come up with what's really behind the Shaver mystery. Shaver insisted all the way along that the caves were really down there in the Dero. They had all this ancient machinery left over from Atlantis and Lemuria, and they were down there, these evil, twisted Dero creatures like evil imps running these fantastic machines and causing us all kinds of problems on the surface with their diabolical mind control and all of this kind of stuff. Well, Shaver, now, you may think as a result of all this that Shaver was Looney Tunes, and you're right, he was. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a genius, and it doesn't mean he wasn't a very, very good writer. And it also does not mean that he didn't have glimpses and visions into something that has a level of reality. Not in our dimension. That's obvious. That's really obvious. But Shaver continued to insist that it did have that if we dug deep enough, we'd find this cavern network, and we'd find these demented characters, and we'd find them persecuting a few sane people down there trying to get away from them. And in other words, what he was imagining was literally a medieval hell, a modern, super modern, scientific medieval hell, but basically it was a medieval hell. And he insisted that it was physically real in our dimension. Palmer really didn't give him much of an alternative. The parallel world theory at that time was a literary device. It was used in science fiction, as I say. It was used in H.G. Wells' Men Like Gods. And where Wells described the different layers, like pages in a book, the different layers of time and space. And from that very, very meager literary convenience definition that Wells used, Shaver developed something that was very sophisticated and very, which we'll get into in a little bit, very possible explanation for other dimensions. Now, as I say, that because now we realize, as a result of the theories of quantum physics and the new theories of the universe, that yes, we could very well have parallel worlds. They actually could exist. And if they do, and if this would explain a lot of very strange phenomena, but some of which we'll discuss tonight, some of which I've experienced, and magicians we'll be talking with tonight with people who have experienced some of this, and magic, of course, can bridge. Magic can open gateways into these other dimensions. So what I'd like to do is take a look right quick in Hidden World A5, and Palmer says, after he says that in his editorial, he says, definitely Shaver admitted to him that he'd never been in the caves. Palmer says that. And okay, and Palmer then says, you must be asking if Shaver was not in any caves, and yet had his experiences exactly as described, where did he have them? The answer to this question is, and always has been, in Shaver's own accounts, in his fiction, fictions in quote, in his fiction stories. All through them are indications of the truth, a truth that Shaver himself knew, perhaps only subconsciously in part, but nonetheless, he knew it. And in this issue, we reprint Shaver's fictional story, The Mind Rovers, which we strongly suspect Shaver wrote in an attempt to give the reader a clue as to where his caves were. Now, The Mind Rovers is a story that's kind of inspired by Jack London's Star Rover, in which these poor guys in San Quentin, they put in straight jackets for long periods of time, and they astral projected out to different periods in time and all. The only way they could keep from going totally insane was to astral project, and what they call beating the jacket. And inspired by this story, Shaver came up with a story called The Mind Rovers. This takes place in a prison, and Shaver had spent 8 years in an asylum for the criminally insane. He was a criminal, but I mean, he ended up in there anyway, and so he was very much in tune with the environment that this story exploits. But anyway, these fellows in this particular prison, in the Mind Rovers, their warden is particularly sadistic and corrupt, and so they miniaturize themselves, magically miniaturize themselves to where they're very, very tiny, and then they have a little kind of a tiny little flying machine. And this is very natural. and they fly into the warden's brain. They get inside the warden's brain, and the warden's brain is like a kingdom. It's just like a dark kingdom inside. Shaver kind of anthropomorphizes the warden's brain. It gives it all sorts of characteristics, like it's some kind of a strange kingdom. And in the center of it is the warden's ego. Now, this, I got to tell you, the warden is an ex-Nazi anyway, and so he has a very, very nasty ego. And this ego is a big sort of thrashing monster in the center of this whole thing. And they subdue the Nazi warden's ego. So what Palmer is driving at when he says that Shaver's given us a clue to this, Shaver's not really trying to tell us that his caves are in our brains. But what he is trying to tell us is that our minds are the way into this world. This is the message here in the Mind Rovers. However, let's go in the same magazine, A5, the same journal. Let's go over to page 884, and magazine isn't that long. It's just that they're sequenced. The journals are on page sequences. And Shaver has an article, Fiction Fact Theory Science, and he starts off this way. A point which I suspect few SF writers or fans ever fully realize is this: a certain percentage of science fiction stories are true stories, fact accounts, which are so amazing, so tremendously unbelievable, that they can only be printed as fiction, since no editor would even look at them under any other heading. Abraham Merritt was one of these writers who knew amazing things and got the accounts published under the guise of fiction. James Branch Cabell's Felix Keniston is another of these personal experience accounts, which is passed off as fantasy. But it is not fantasy to anyone who has the key. That key, similar experiences in their own life, is possessed by the audience to whom such men as Cabell and Merritt really address their work, somewhat in the spirit in which bottles containing manuscripts are cast upon the sea. Now, there's a world of secret instruction in that
in that, because Abraham Merritt, one of the greatest fantasy writers America has ever produced, beautiful, beautiful stories. He did the Ship of Ishtar, and he did the Moon Pool, which, of course, we went out to Non Madol, and we showed scenes of Non Madol and showed exclusive footage of the underwater ruins out in the Pacific. That's all from Merritt's Moon Pool. But we actually went out there for Beyond Lemuria and showed this. That under Non Madol, under that ruined city in the Caroline Islands in the middle of the Pacific, according to Merritt, was this huge undersea cavern, which was the last remnants of Lemuria, and they were highly scientific, and they also had, some of them were very, very evil. And since that time, other writers and mystics have assumed that there is a connection, direct connection between Non Madol, those caverns underneath Non Madol, and Mount Shasta. So that connection has been made by various writers. Now, I might also mention that some of you magic buffs, that this is also covered to a lesser degree in Kenneth Grant's final book, The Ninth Art. Now, James Branch Cabell, on the other hand, was we can't just call him a great fantasy writer. James Branch Cabell was one of the finest literary authors that this country ever produced. His work is literature. And he wrote he wrote fantasy, but he wrote fantasy of such depth and such beauty and such meaning and such consummate erudition that James Branch Cabell is considered literature. Now, James Branch Cabell's Felix Keniston, that particular story, and this is very important if you understand this. Felix Keniston, that story is about a not too successful Virginia gentleman who writes these romances, and his wife, he doesn't get along with his wife very well. In fact, they just hardly speak to each other. And he is miserable in his living existence, but he lives in his stories and in what he writes, and he dreams a lot of what he writes. And he finds, that's just the story that Shaver's talking about now. Keniston finds this talisman in his garden one day. And this is a little broken piece of metal that has this strange inscription on it. And this talisman transports him to his dream world, to this fantasy kingdom of mythical southern France and King Arthur's time and something like that. And this talisman is the key to getting him there. Well, now this story is called The Cream of the Chest. Now, the reason why it's called The Cream of the Chest is because this talisman finally turns out to be, after all these marvelous adventures, Keniston finally has to realize that this talisman is really part of the lid off of a bottle of his wife's beauty cream. In other words, Cabell, for all of his erudition and all of his attention to detail and all of his wonderful storytelling and all of this, is pulling our leg. He's saying, "Oh, come on now! All this magical talisman really turns out to be just a part of the lid of his work." So Shaver must have believed in Cabell's being able to reach this other dimension with a magical device that wasn't even a magical device, and yet he firmly believed it. Firmly, well, because when you read Cream of the Chest, and I think it's delightful, it's beautiful. Let me interject, though, that the first James Branch Cabell novel that you folks should read is Jurgen, Jurgen, Jurgen. That's the classic. That is Cabell's most magical novel. And it even has the Gnostic Mass in it in one chapter. Jurgen is one that every magician, every occultist, and every romantic fantasy buff should read Jurgen. But after that, read The Cream of the Chest. You'll enjoy it. The reason why Shaver really believed that Keniston's story was true is because of all of the detail that Cabell put into it. Cabell was a great world creator and he had lineages. He worked out his Patsime province in southern France. He worked this thing out to the point where the way Tolkien worked out Middle Earth. I mean, he really, really did it. And, there are a lot of people that believe that, shit on. People that believe that Middle Earth, Tolkien, is really true, and it's really there. And maybe it is. Maybe it is. May very well be. Now, let's get to the simultane here. Have we got anybody on yet? Anybody on? Nobody? Okay, let me get to the description of Shaver's simultane, so you really you get the meat of what he is coming up with. This is in Erdis Cliff, and this is the third part of the Red Dwarf stories. Let me mention, too, if you look up the Red Dwarf on Amazon, you're going to run into a science fiction video, a science fiction television series called The Red Dwarf, and that has nothing whatsoever to do with Shaver's Red Dwarf, so don't get confused. The only way you can find the Red Dwarf stories are, as far as I know, they're not even in Hidden World. They may be in the later issues. Now, this is from Erdis Cliff. Of course, Lua, it is not as you think, but it's bad enough. I have no other way to get him back, else I should make such demands of you never. But for him, I must do this, and to the two of you there. It can be years. Now, what the witch here, Feroni, is doing is she's sending these two lovers back to get her lover out of somewhere in the simultane, and she's to send them through. And so she says, there it can be years, not year, but minutes to you. There it can be minutes, and here long lifetimes. Which hope is what keeps me waiting and alive, and the way open for him, I do not know. Days passed, and Egan wore now a permanent look of fixed astonishment. For all the world he knew had turned into insubstantial veils of gauze beside the realities he saw daily. And this day they were ready, and Feronius showed them the door that was not a door, but a flickering dread, nonetheless, that went in and in forever into the rock, or into space, or where no one could not see for the blue flames that licked always upward and across that tube of force. And hand in hand, they too walked into the tube and along it, and the flames burned at them, and the vibrant forces of it stung their feet. But something else from behind them accelerated and protected them, and they walked on, courageous and with high heads. And now through the walls they saw the naked anatomy of the simultane. And about it, the immaterial, tenuous, whirling, lacy curtains of repeated nows, thin and separated by only time, as the leaves of a book unleaf in the wind. On one of those painted windows that are worlds like our own, but different, is where our quarry is trapped, though his voice was strong and Egan's ear strong and brave. Yet it wavered as if from the very awe of the terrible repeated variance of the simultane which mortal eyes never see. What would happen to us if that dark, lovely witch of Erdis shut off the great machine that throws this flow of energy upon which we walk? Egan asked, staring hard at Lewis' face, transparent now as tinted glass, a tall ghost of a life wavering beside him as a thin wine glass shivers from repeated ringing blows. We would blink out like two lights the wind blew upon, and this fearful tube of force with us, of course. Lua did not look at Egan, but her eyes searched all the fearful complexities of the repeated planes of immaterial reality, separated by the dark nothings that she felt were just as much as something beyond her eyes searching or her mind's grasp. We must travel to the end of this, no matter what may happen to stop us, for that is how this Druga of hers planned it. And then he was to return without delay, but he did not return. And neither will we without him. But I could not bear her face to come back without her little son. And Egan fell to watching the endless shadow play of life and the cities and the works and the movements of the worlds that their strange, vibrant walkway seemed to drive through as split through a vowel, and as a sword drives through the pages of a picture book. And each page was a world without end, to his eyes stretching beyond sight, tall towers square and endlessly windowed, where little ships flew through the air and big ships plowed the oceans, and men lived and died, and there on that immaterial transparence that was to him but a tinted glass or a film clip of soap bubbles, and a child peering into the clustering walls of the bubbles, and they passed on through the walls of this world of speeding planes and smoking ships and clanking machines, and another world, and another, and many another still, and each different and varied, yet monotonously the same in a weird repetition of shape and size and movement and meaning to his eyes. And far up they could feel Veronia manipulating the terrible power that upheld them, and the tubes about them seemed to lower, and their stomachs felt the rush downwards. The time she set for us has passed, and she is trying to set us exactly down where she sat her man down and left him there, and she has done exactly as she remembered it. And if she's right in her work, and we find some trace of him, and if not, why, we'd just better stay where chance leaves us. We can try and try again. If we return to the tube of force, she will know and will repeat the calculations differently. And now it seemed that the tube lay open before them, and they walked out on the plane of the simultane, as Egan thought, but immediately they stepped upon that bare and awful rock of the ever-existent. It changed, and there was grass over the soft earth, springy under their feet, and the frightening transparence of the inconsequential reality had gone, and the simultane had gone from their eyes, hidden by the now reality of the world they had set foot upon. Okay, that gives you an idea of the way the simultane is visualized and works. Now, this was written in 1948, and since then, that same type of concept has, in another 15 years, lots of people were using this in science fiction stories and in films, and we've all seen this, and of course we use it in with our intergravitron in Beyond Lemuria, and this is really what Shaver actually believed. I mean, this is what he believed, but you have to understand that at the time he was writing this was not considered. This was not considered really in any way possible. This was just a literary device, a very, very handy literary device, but it was a literary device. And so therefore, Shaver clung to the publicly, and he insisted that this world, the subterranean world that he was in contact with, was physically real in this dimension. Now, Palmer, and this is another thing we find it out in the hidden world, but also too, it's confirmed in Richard Toronto, by the way, is I think the top shaver collector and shaver authority in the world. And he has a website called Shavertron, and I strongly recommend that. If you want to dig through the archives, you'll find an interview between Richard and myself in there. But Richard Toronto has recently come out with the definitive book on Shaver and Palmer. Now, I'm not saying it's a definitive book on the mystery, but it's a definitive book on Shaver and Palmer from a scholarly and let's say a literary point of view. It's a biography of both men, and you have to do the biography of both men together because their whole situation it involves both of them so much. Both of them. This is called War Over Lemuria. You can get it on Amazon. I just read it, and it's excellent. And I'm going to put a good review on there on it. But it's War Over Lemuria, and it's Richard Toronto, and what he says in there is that he confirms that Palmer's idea of the astral plane that he kept trying to convince Shaver of was not the astral plane of Hermetic occultism. He probably could have talked Shaver into that. He probably could have. But instead of that, Palmer was hipped on this philosophy book. And this philosophy is sort of an earlier 19th century Eurasia. Philosophy was a channeled work by someone who was steeped in biblical lore and wrote his own spiritualist Bible, basically. And Palmer tried to convince Shaver that his Deros and his Teros and Deros and his underground world was really not underground at all. It was up in the upper atmosphere, in the stratosphere, and it was the world of the disembodied spirits of the dead, according to philosophy. Well, Shaver wasn't about to buy that, and he just. I don't blame him. If I were a crazy genius like Shaver, I wouldn't buy it either. I mean, I thought I assumed for years that Palmer was a serious, was an occultist in the Western tradition, and Theosophy actually has an astral plane that does involve the underground like that, and that would have worked. But that's not what Palmer tried to convince Shaver of. So consequently, Shaver, in defense, he kept his parallel worlds idea to himself. And he was ahead of everybody else in actually reifying this thing. But he knew that at his time, parallel worlds were a literary device, and they weren't going to suffice. So he kept it to himself, and he insisted they were real, and yet Palmer tried to foist this spiritualism thing on Shaver, and I don't blame Shaver for rejecting it. So the point of all of this is that Shaver's stories, from this point of view, we should take another look at Shaver. We should realize that Shaver was, he was kind of caught in this trap. Sure, he was crazy, but he was picking up on something, because this underworld of his, and Shaver was a very, very well read in mythology and in anthropology and mythology. He really was very, very well read and very well and really knew his ancient history and what he was doing was he was giving us a version of something that's been in our mythology and in our folklore. It's so much a part of the human, all over the world, of the human race, that the chances are, and I think personally, that somewhere in the simultane, not too far away, is this world that Shaver was trying to tell us was real, and somewhere in that simultane, if the simultane exists, and I think it does, then there it is. Now, that's by the way, one of the reasons why I'm doing this show is that we're going to re-release Beyond Lemuria early next year by spring. We're going to re-release Beyond Lemuria with a new cover and a new booklet. And we already have a booklet in there on the Mount Shasta part of it. Now we're going to have a booklet on the Shaver mystery in there with Beyond Lemuria along with a new cover. And so what I've just been discussing will be covered in that booklet, in the new booklet for Beyond Lemuria to be coming up again. So those of you who haven't seen Beyond Lemuria, watch for it. And those of you who have, you want to get this new booklet. What I want to do is I want to get a discussion going here on these other dimensions in relation to magic. What we want to do here is have a discussion about this parallel world theory and its relation to magic and these other dimensions, which very, very much go into magic. Those of you familiar with Kenneth Grant, he called this magical dimension that we get into in our temple work as the mauve zone. And one of the reasons why he calls it the mauve zone is that it's kind of electric blue and kind of purplish, and as you go into it. And this is one of the things we do in magical work, is we actually get into this nearby other dimension. I think the concept of the simultane very definitely relates to that. And let me get into the scientific aspect of this a little bit. And I'm sitting here looking at a book by Michio Kaku called Parallel Worlds: Journey Through Creation, Higher Dimensions and the Future of the Cosmos, okay? Now, Michio Kaku is, as you probably know, probably the most popular writer. He's a physicist, by the way. He's probably the most popular writer on the mysteries, the modern mysteries of quantum physics. There's things like string theory and M theory and whatever. So one of his books is on parallel worlds, and so I want to read you his analogy here. This is on page 112 in Parallel Worlds. Okay. But perhaps the strangest of these anomalies is the possibility of parallel universes and gateways connecting them. If we recall the metaphor introduced by Shakespeare that all the world is a stage, then general relativity admits the possibility of trapdoors. But instead of leading to the basement, we find that the trapdoors lead to parallel stages. Like the original, imagine a stage of life consisting of multi-story stages, one on top of the next. On each stage, the actors read their lines and wander about the set, thinking that their stage is the only one, oblivious to the possibilities of alternate realities. However, if one day they accidentally fall into a trapdoor, they find themselves thrust into an entirely new stage with new laws and new rules and a new script. Now, that's from Dr. Kaku, and let's see, that book is this book's published by Doubleday, and this is the latest idea. I did a poem about M theory and a poem. Sandra, do you got a copy of the Green Ray up there? I think you do, right there. Yeah, I have a copy of the Green Ray. Thanks, son. No, I did this poem, and it's in the Green Ray. Actually, I didn't do the poem. A counterpart of mine in another dimension. There was another dimension called Alt Magic years ago, and I believe it was still part of the simultaneous. Now it finally deteriorated, but in that other dimension, I was a character called Dryad, and I had this ode to M theory. And it's sung to the tune "If I Only Had a Brain" from The Wizard of Oz. And somebody, bless his heart, did a thing on YouTube where he's got me singing this, and he has puts the scarecrow's face on mine and one thing or another. It's really cute. It's Poke Runyon singing "If I Only Had a Brain," so you can look it up on YouTube. There it goes, but the old theory goes this way. I'd put Einstein in suspension, and I'd find a new dimension if I only had a brain. Of course, brain is B-R-A-N-E, and short for membrane. I'd zoom in upon a fractal and bring back a pterodactyl if I only had a brain. Like Tarzan, I'd be swinging where the gravitons are springing if I only had a brain. Through a wormhole I'd be diving, in the past I'd be arriving, if I only had a brain. Oh, equations won't seem hazy, and Kabbalah won't seem crazy, when I finally get a brain. And that, of course, is a humorous take on what is very, very, very possibly the actual truth of our universe. And I'm reminded of the old hippie joke, there's the ocean, of course, is many miles deep and has many layers of different animal forms that live in it, and you get down to the bottom and there are creatures down there that can't possibly exist in the higher levels. And they're dark down there and they have their own illumination and all this. So the ocean is really a whole world in itself. And these two hippies are out on Santa Monica Pier, and they're both stoned. And one of them is looking out at the Pacific, and he says, "Man, that's a lot of water out there." And his friend says, "Yeah, and that's only the top." And that's essentially what we're looking at here. So in the magical temple operations, we can, and you can tell when you're doing a crystal ball operation. You can tell when that ball starts to get the aura around it, and you get this feeling, this tingly feeling, and hey, we're not in the same place anymore. We're in the same place, but somehow or other, this is not the same world. You have that feeling, and that feeling, quite frankly, okay, I got somebody who am I talking with? Mike?
Hey.
Chris? Oh,
hey,
is this Chris?
Chris? Yes, it is.
Yeah, well, speak closer to the phone because I'm okay. So
Here, is this a little bit? Is this better?
Yeah, right. You've been following everything we've been talking about? Have you followed everything we've been talking about?
Yeah, I've been having some technical difficulties here and there, but I've been listening other than that, yeah.
Well, you're going to have to keep that phone right close to your mouth.
Okay.
So you followed everything so far, right?
Yeah, I've been listening.
Okay, so now this is Chris Cooley, right?
Yes.
Now Chris Cooley is going to be with us next week, and he's going to do his presentations on love magic, and this is going to be quite fascinating. And he's done this before. I got to say that Chris is a brother of mine in another order, a kind of a stodgy old traditional order, but it's one of the oldest and the best. And so Chris is going to talk next week. He's going to talk about the magic of love and possibly we could call it sex magic, but let's call it love magic. You may believe it on a little higher plane. And Chris, what do you think about this interdimensional? Give us some thoughts about this interdimensional idea.
Well, I haven't read any Richard Shaver yet myself, but I can tell you that, even just the world that he creates within the page, you could consider another dimension. And you're experiencing it as you read through it, too. So clearly he must have experienced it in order to write it. Even if it was, in his head, it could still be another dimension that he's experiencing, whether through an avatar of a person that's actually there, or you could even say that there's a higher dimensional something controlling us that we, are while we're plugged into this, we experience, this dimension in this way. But then once this ride is over, we have a, pre-existing and ongoing higher dimensional self that experienced all that and grew from it and everything, but is not limited to that. Almost like
Shaver's case, Shaver's case, most of it, a lot of what he got was very what we would call lower. He was being tormented. He was being tormented by these demonic Dero creatures from something that was very much a modern, very modern super science version of a medieval hell. So we could say this was a lower thing, but then when he got into his fantasies, there are parts in the Red Dwarf stories that we're reading tonight that really are at a higher level. So I think he was ranging in different dimensions. Do you ever have any experiences like this yourself?
Well, I mean, like I was saying, I think that the world of fiction, whether it's based on true-ish experience or something you think you made up, I do kind of on a certain level consider that living in another dimension while you're living in the dimension of that story, But I think that's part of what magic is too, and I think that's how it ties in. Is you like you said, you consider him a great writer. Despite, who he might have been as a person and all this controversy surrounding that, like just the fact that he was a good writer, is a kind of magic itself. And he was living in another dimension in order to tap into that, world to create it in order for us to be able to share the experience by reading his books. So as an artist of various sorts, I definitely live in other dimensions at certain times that I'm experiencing and recording somehow in order to share that experience. And it might not be exactly the same as the experience I felt being that intermediary between this world and that world, but it's a representation of what that experience was like, and then you get to share that when you watch it or listen to it or read it.
I think you're right there. That I think there are levels of this, and there are levels of intensity in this. You can be in another dimension in a very shall we say, very reflective kind of a way, a sort of almost like an observer where you're not really involved. But then on other occasions, you can actually be involved to the point where, like in a very intense dream, where you are involved, you're emotionally involved every other way. But then there's like lucid dreaming where you are in control of the dream, but the dream is still has its own validity. And then there's the reverie kind of thing where you sort of you're making it up in a way, but you're making it up as you're intuitively receiving it, and that's another level. One thing that we have kind of a conflict a lot of times with the military way of doing this and the occult way of doing it. The military way of doing it is you have a target, you go for the target wherever that may be on the map, and the first impressions you get, that's it, and you don't go any further, because as far as the military is concerned, if you go further, you're laying your imagination is interpreting. They call that an analytical overlay, and they won't. They just want a first impression, and that's it. And so we have to ask ourselves a question, and they get some good stuff. I mean, that's effective. But the question is, how much are we coloring this ourselves, and how much are we actually intuiting? I like to think that it's a combination. That there's that the more intense it is, the more real it is. As far as that's my measure. Is if the intensity and the power of it gives you more reality. If is sort of a, sort of something that you're kind of putting together, that would you agree with that?
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I wouldn't necessarily agree, because I think sometimes the more subtle experience can be, more powerful because of its subtlety as well. That would, be almost like saying, oh, well, the only good movies are the ones with big explosions and, fast action and all this stuff, when there's like a whole wide array of films, like there's a whole wide array of experience. And sometimes, like, some of the most profound things will be like a little more hidden or a little more subtle, and it takes more concentration just to, tune into that frequency to be able to interpret it, But then when you're rewarded by it.
I agree with you. I agree with you, and I don't think I expressed myself very clearly on that one. What I meant was, I don't mean a lot of action. That's not it. What I mean is intensity. Is because you can have a subtle and a very nuanced experience, and with subtlety and without a lot of blood and thunder, and still have intensity. In other words, a reality about it. In other words, what I'm saying is as you know, in dreams, there are dreams that it's just like, dreams of when you go to a strange place in a dream, and there's nothing necessarily that's happening. You're just in a strange place, but you have this very intense feeling in the dream that this is real. This is super real. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, and I agree. I totally agree with you. But at the same time, okay, like, say like intensity, like when you say something's intense, you're like almost referring to like tension itself. Like, say you're watching a film or even listening to a piece of music, and there's a part where you'd say it's intense, right? Like maybe it's like making your blood pump more, and like it's you're feeling it, and it's a powerful experience. But then sometimes maybe that intensity is like it'll go in a wave, like a roller coaster wouldn't be interesting if it was just constant loops. It's got valleys in order to balance.
One of the reasons why I think Shaver believed that James Branch Cabell was writing true stories was because of all of the amount of research and work and calculation that Cabell put into his stories. His stories themselves were rather drawl, and there wasn't a lot of sensational action in them. They were very, very sophisticated and very drawl, but they were magnificently crafted. Cabell wrote on three levels, and literature, in order to qualify as literature, you only have to write on two levels, but he wrote on three and sometimes four levels, and I think that so impressed Shaver that Shaver thought, he believed it was real, and that Cabell wasn't really writing this; he was just recording it. And I personally think Cabell was a combination of both. I think Cabell was recording it because obviously the work he put into it, structuring it, and structuring the stories in such a way but as a writer myself, I rewrite, and if I don't get something like that, I'll just, I'll work it over. And so consequently, I looked at some of my own, even though it may be fantasy writing or whatever. I looked at it and I think, oh gosh, I think I put that together, But then on the other hand, maybe I was supposed to put it together that way. I don't know, And yet, my friend Lynn Carter, he would just lie down. He would sit down in his easy chair. He had an idea for his characters, idea for his book. Set the characters up, sit down, close his eyes, and run the whole thing like a movie. And then he'd get up and he'd go to the typewriter, he'd screw in white paper, have a little bit of correction fluid maybe, and put a carbon in there, crank out a manuscript and send it in and get it published. That was amazing. I could never do anything like that. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that this is like a ongoing question with a lot of artists, where like, especially some of the more profound ones where it's so deep, and you can read so much into it, where it's, like could they have really been conscious of that? Or is that like something, higher, something more divine, like working through them, and they are just getting out of the way. They're just getting their ego out of the way and letting, letting the art come out, which I think when, like you say, when it's intense, is when it's like hitting the truth, when it's like ringing that bell and you can feel it, and then like, and I think a lot of times that's just when like, who we consider the artist or whatever, who we consider the writer, just gets out of the way and lets the message be told, like why are we there, right? There to be said,
Well, let's get a little supernatural here for a minute. I had an experience, and I mentioned this to a couple of my friends when we were getting ready for this show. I had an experience years ago that I think was walking into another dimension somehow, and then walking back out of it. Back in 1972, I think it was. One of my grandparents died, and I went back to for the funeral, and it was in Georgia. And I went back to this little village in Georgia, and where I grew up as a kid. And there was Grandma lying there in the coffin, and whatever. And I needed to get out of the house, and so I walked from our old house in Georgia. And I came from California and then back to Georgia, and I walked just like I had so many times as a kid. I walked down to the little neighborhood theater. This was 1972, and I figured I'd just see a movie, whatever movie was there. And they were playing a film called The Execution of Private Slovak. And I was hardly anybody in the theater to watch this thing. It was in black and white. And as I recall, it was with Martin Sheen or young Martin Sheen or whatever. But it was The Execution of Private Slovak. And I sat through this thing and didn't particularly like it, but it was, it was a black and white film, and it was well done. And then went home, and then left a couple of days later, flew back to California, and almost 20 years later, this film shows up. A TV Guide says they're making The Execution of Private Slovak in Canada as a TV movie, and no mention whatsoever of this film ever being made before. And I looked at this, and my heavens, what's going on here? Have they dusted this thing off and colorized it, and they're going to try to present it as that they're actually producing this thing and all this, an article and TV Guide and all of that? And so I asked some friends of mine in the movie industry about it, and they said, "Oh no, it was made up in Canada, and I know new people that were working on it and everything else." And I go, what is going on here? And so I thought, my first thought was, just like Shaver, like this was a big conspiracy and they're pulling something here and they're trying to get this old film that didn't go back during the early days of the Vietnam War. This thing didn't go at all. Now they're trying to re-release it. Now they've colorized it. Now they got this big phony campaign going on. They got people that are even saying that they made it. See, I don't think this is what happened at all, because I went back to Georgia. I hadn't been there since I was 9 years old. I was back in that old house. I walked down to that old theater that I'd gone to as a kid. I saw this film. I know that was the film I saw, but that film was not made until 20 years later. Now, what do you think of that?
Well, when did you see the film?
I saw it in 1972. And the film wasn't made, and it wasn't made until 20 years later.
Well, according to Wikipedia, it was made for television, but it aired in 1974. But I don't know. It's possible it's possible they would have made a film print of it also. Like I know, Ronald Reagan's last film, The Killers, which was a remake of a film that was made 20 years prior, was made for television, but they ended up releasing it theatrically first, and didn't show it on television until much later. But I don't know. It's based
Well,
on a
maybe,
book.
maybe, then maybe I'm right. Maybe it was maybe they did. Maybe they did really pull a real fast one, because TV Guide made no mention whatsoever of it being done years ago. None whatsoever. In fact, they claimed that the whole thing was shot in Canada, and I even talked to people who said they worked on it in the Canadian one, the Canadian TV version.
Huh.
You know, I mean, I wonder, you know, and but maybe if it said it came out in '74, huh?
Uh-huh.
That means I could have seen it in '70.
It's also based on a book that came out in 1954. So you never know. Maybe there was an entirely different adaptation of it that you ended up seeing, you know, and then no one ever heard of it later. You know?
Yeah, it might be. It might be. It was really strange, though, because, as I said, I tried at the time. I tried to find out. Now, maybe, you know, let's face, maybe you know, that's it. But that was a strange one, to me anyway. And so I just, you know, I kept trying to find out. It wasn't on Wikipedia back when it came out in the '90s. Because is there any indication
that thing we're writing history every day? You know, I mean, there's you know, all of our collective knowledge, you know, which we're sharing. You know, I mean, you and I were talking earlier. You know, like talk about, you know, an alternate dimension or a parallel world. You know, that's essentially what the internet is. You know, and it's a reflection of our world, but it's still, you know, its own universe in a lot of respects too, you know, and it's writing our history. Like I've never seen this film, so I have no, you know, personal experience to say anything about it, but the internet, you know, says this at this time, and then who knows what else it'll say tomorrow. Maybe they'll talk, oh yeah, there were some theatrical prints that were released, you know, in certain parts of the country or etc. You know, but like then history will be rewritten again, you know.
Let me give you another one. 2 years before Avatar came out, there was an animated film that was released on television, and an animated film that was almost the same script as Avatar. And as soon as Avatar, you know, came out, you couldn't find it. You couldn't find any reference to it. It just disappeared, and there was no reference.
About Atlantis? Atlantis, the Lost World?
No, it wasn't that. I looked at
because that's almost essentially the same script as well. And
well,
I mean, I think
yeah. But it wasn't Atlantis. There was another film, but it was almost the same as Avatar. They had the big tree, you know, and the American Marine or whatever, and yeah, it was so similar that I was just wondering why. What Dickens? Why isn't there any mention of this? And nobody ever mentioned it. I suppose, you know, but you know, I don't know. As I said,
well, but that's the thing, you know. I mean, there's theories that there's only so many stories too that we just retell, you know. And like, is it that they're really ripping off other authors or other versions of it, or are they just telling an aspect of the human experience and expressing, you know, and you know.
But speaking
like
of
that,
but however, you were saying though that the internet is its own dimension. And it's very, very true. It is. In fact, I think that H.G. Wells predicted something like the internet. He said that back in before World War I, H.G. Wells was predicting that we would have this communication, that everybody would be able to communicate fully with each other in a network of some sort. And so the network itself has taken on a kind of a dimension. It's become its own dimension.
Well, you know, tying this into magic, you know, I think that the internet is a reflection of a higher dimension where we all are already connected. You know, like I like to think of it as the internet, you know, and like the more we disconnect from all outer sensation period, the more you are connected to all things and experience anyway. And I do feel like in a lot of ways we do share information and experience already through that unified experience, you know. And then the internet is like our lower dimensional, you know, like version of that same thing, you know. And like whichever, because the internet has so many different things to so many different people, and whatever you're tuned into at that time is, you know, affecting your experience in this dimension, but it all exists all at the same time, and it's all there, you know. It's the same thing when you go inside of you too. like you were talking about Shiver, maybe hearing from these underworld creatures or these demons, like Carl Jung talks about those demons just being aspects of our inner psychology, and these are all reflections of ourselves and our own issues and everything that we work out in the form of these actual creatures, and it's a way of, discussing with ourself, with our subconsciousness, like, and working through, problems that we have created, like, video games are another really good example of this, where this is, another dimension, literally, especially like older video games where it goes into 2D, you're experiencing this second dimension world, and like you are connected because your movements connect the character on the film, or on the screen, and like, say like, you're Mario and you jump into a pit, you're going to like jump and like feel, to it. It might be subtle, but depending on how into the game you are, it can be very intense as well. Like you could like actually feel your heart jump, and your whole body react, because you are connected with that character in so many ways, and even that could be a metaphor for this acting in a higher dimension where we are that character. We are the avatar in the third dimension, and there's something much higher in that dimension that we can hardly even perceive, hardly even comprehend, in this wall connected in this lower dimension, but it affects us too. Just like if you're playing Mario and someone like taps you on the shoulder and like, you might get, fall into a pit because of that, because someone distracted you and you're pulled out of that dimension for a moment into this other dimension. You could say that happens on higher dimensions as well. And I don't mean, his underworld could be what I refer to as higher dimensions. I just mean extra dimensional, something outside of, this three-dimensional sphere that we, experience the majority of the time while we're in this world. That there can be other aspects of that in other dimensions that are still connected with
each
our
person.
experience.
One of the things, though, that we realize in magic, we find it out all the time, especially in working together, like we say, we're working with people around an Armadillo altar, and we have several people channeling a particular angel or a particular spirit, and what they get is not the same. So each individual person perceives these dimensions differently because these dimensions are very definitely connected with themselves. In other words, the connection is so we're not all like for instance, when I'm not trying to indicate that Shaver's perception is true for everybody. No, it was true for Shaver and had a validity for him. But other people would see it differently, and other people would experience it differently. And that, of course, is one of the mysteries, I think, of magic, is that, yes, we can perceive higher and lower dimensions, but we will perceive them in our own way and in our own context. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that we should bear in mind that, he also created that world as well, and that is what his books are a representation of, and that's why we can even talk about it. That's why we can even share any of his experiences, whether he thought he really experienced them or not. He, did create the experience of being able to read it too, and I think that's, part of the magic too, and part of, what is, that's why we're talking about it,
Yeah. Tell you what, we're gonna wrap up, and what I want you to do is give us talk a little bit about your website, and so people can go there and try to get familiar with what you're doing, and then we'll come back next week and you can give us your wonderful lecture on the magic of love and whatever. So give us your website information and all of that.
Well, I don't currently have presence really for my magical writing, but there's things you can look up online, but we can talk more about that next week. However, I also have a musical project that is, discusses a lot of these things too, but, I think that, art can say things that you can't necessarily discuss, like the true Tao cannot be spoken of, kind of thing, but you can share an experience through art, and that's part of sharing that knowledge that we've gained while in this dimension too, But I have a band called Mephisto.
Well, you did. Whoa! You did this presentation at Descent. You did it sometime back at Descent. Where is that? I think that's on the internet somewhere, isn't it?
Yes, I did a presentation called Sex Magic Beyond Good and Evil, and it was like there's 3 segments, one of which made it onto YouTube, the other 2 of which are on a hard drive that is currently down that I may revive at some point. But I'm working on a book. I'm working on putting together another presentation at some point in the near future too. But it's just one of many projects going, like I have this musical project called Mephisto that I'm working on as well. We just did our first vinyl record release, and we're going to start playing some shows soon too. And I have a couple of film projects myself that are on the back burner. I have a production company called Neptune Films, if anyone wants to look that up. But HyperfireRecords.com is the music website, if anyone would like to check that out. But yeah, we will discuss all this stuff next week and how to tie in with Kabbalah and magic and all this stuff.
Okay, sounds good. We'll see you next week, same time and 8 o'clock, and that'll be same place and Thursday night, and we're looking forward to it. And meanwhile, good magic.